Greetings, fellow scribes! Welcome back to the archive. This week I begin a two-part series talking about Decipher's Star Trek RPG. Now, this is the third Star Trek RPG published out of a total of, at the time of this video, 4. You, of course, had the original Star Trek RPG, the Prime Directive, which was published by Task Force Games / Amarillo Design Bureau. You had the FASA era Star Trek. You had the deciphered version of Star Trek, and you have the current one released by Modiphius, Star Trek Adventures. So, I'm going to be starting talking about the one thing that 3 of them have in common: the Star Trek Prime Timeline universe. So sit back, relax, and enjoy as we start trekking. One of the things that makes Star Trek really kind of neat is that it unabashedly recognizes that there are multiple different continuities within their continuity. You've got the Prime Timeline, which is the original series, the original animated series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager, and for the most part, Enterprise. You've got the whatever timeline Discovery is in. You've got the timeline of the novels. You've got the timeline of course, the movies, the Kelvin timeline. And of course, you take all these, put these aside, and you've got the Starfleet universe timeline. And all of these are still Star Trek. Some are less Trek than others, but for the most part, they're all Trek. And one of the great challenges for any RPG is figuring out how to approach these. Because, let's face it, once you start playing an RPG, you're making a new timeline. And that's sort of how you want to approach these. But, for the most part, the Prime Timeline is what most people look at. So, this is the Star Trek we all know and love. This is where you have the United Federation of Planets sending out its peaceful exploration vessels with the firepower to raise planets. And they deal with such wonderful adversaries as the Klingons and the Romulans, as well as a number of other lesser threats. Oh, and occasionally there's godlike beings, because it's space. And this is the thing you have to really, really think about with Trek. Trek is its own entity. It has its own unique tropes. Godlike beings, whether it be Barclay taking over the Enterprise in the holodeck and his creativity combined with everything he does in the holodeck, generating so much information so fast that he's able to literally teleport the Enterprise across the galaxy and back at a whim. Or whether it's the Squire of Gothel, who's keeping people imprisoned on his world unless they do what he wants, but he turns out he's just a spoiled child. Or whether it be the actual Q Continuum with our good old buddy Q. There's godlike entities that are a huge pop-up in Star Trek. And of course, this is not counting the actual appearance of God in Star Trek V. So that's one of our tropes. The other trope is, of course, the ships themselves, the warp cores and all the technobabble, and the ship constantly under danger, and everyone having to figure things out, generally through thinking through the problem or engaging in diplomacy. Not too often, except in the Kirk era, in the original series era, are fist fights a common solution for things. In fact, this leads to another one of the interesting tropes with Star Trek in and of itself. Fights, space battles, tend to be a couple ships and tend to be over quickly. Usually with a ship being crippled and then boarding parties taking it over, though sometimes with a ship blowing up spectacularly because its warp core breached. But this is the thing. Star Trek is not a setting where fights are big, massive, protracted affairs. They're short, and they're usually one-sided. With the sole exception of the Enterprise versus Reliant battle in Wrath of Khan. Most combat in Star Trek, most ship combat, is quick and one-sided. And this is something you have to really keep in mind if you're running a Star Trek game. And the rules should reflect this in some way, shape, or form. So those are the main tropes. As well as, of course, captain leading the away team. Which is weird and somewhat counterintuitive, but it's a Star Trek trope. In fact, you generally have, going down to the planet, the most senior officers. Tactical, captain or first officer, chief engineer, commonly go down in Next Generation. In classic Trek, in the original series, it was always Kirk, Spock, McCoy. Captain, first officer and science officer, chief medical officer. And a couple poor guys who die horribly. Probably named Leibowitz or Kowalski. Just saying. And that, by the way, is where we get the red shirt trope from. Because these poor security officers wore red shirts. But Star Trek is a game, it's a world about these tropes. But what are the factions of Star Trek? Well, that gets a little fun. For the history of Star Trek, in at least the prime timeline, there have been three major factions. You have the United Federation of Planets. These are the ostensible good guys. Their belief is in dealing with forces diplomatically. They are scientists and explorers. They are diplomats. They are not warriors. Until they are. The Federation straddles the divide over both Alpha and Beta quadrants. Because the galaxy is divided into 4 quadrants. Alpha quadrant, Beta quadrant, Gamma quadrant, Delta quadrant. And yeah, as I said, the Federation straddles that divide between Alpha and Beta quadrant, with Earth in the Beta quadrant, and a lot of the more well-known Federation planets like Andoria and Vulcan in the Alpha quadrant. In fact, most of the Federation is in the Alpha quadrant. There's just this sort of little slight offshoot out in the Beta. Of course, you've got one of the lesser factions on the other side of the Federation, the Orions. But for the most part, the Federation is this Alpha and Beta quadrant area. And what the Federation is, as I said, they are a organization based on the principles of peaceful cooperation between their member worlds. They technically do not build warships. Technically. They build vessels of exploration. These vessels tend to have the most recent and best weaponry available put on them. The flagship of the Federation is traditionally a ship named Enterprise, NCC 1701, generally with a letter at the end of it, signifying which Enterprise it is. During the original series era, the NCC 1701 did not have any letter designation because it was the first of its line. It was destroyed by a self-destruct order, and a new ship was built and given to the captain. That was the Enterprise A, the NCC 1701A. Same class as the original. The B was a Excelsior class. The C was an Ambassador class. The D was a Galaxy. The E was a Sovereign class. And that's what we have in the movies. And in television. And this was the flagship of the Federation. And in all of these, this ship was dubbed a ship of peaceful exploration. Had major science sections built into the hull. In fact, the original Enterprise's first officer was also its chief science officer. So it kind of stressed that they were explorers, people going out into the galaxy to, as the opening says, seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before. And they did pretty well at this. The Federation was, for the most part, no real conflicts within it. Now, how they maintained this peaceful facade? Well, first you had such things as brain surgery to correct the criminal elements after people were convicted of a crime. Or if they identified it ahead of time, fixed. You had public replicators, so that anything that people needed, they could just get from a replicator. This led to a culture where money was only used in dealing with outside influences, outside governments. The Federation itself, according to multiple sources throughout the series and movies, didn't have money. Personal property existed. Gifts existed. But you were dealing with a post-scarcity society. So whatever someone needed, all the basics were provided. And then you get into the fact that over time, they moved from having strictly Starfleet personnel to ships carrying the families of these personnel. People who are not contributing to the ship in any way other than they're the wife and child of one person, or the husband and children of another officer on the ship. Basically, they were there for morale. And, oh yeah, perhaps a little subtle bit of do your duty, protect the ship, or else your family dies with it. Because there was this group called Section 31. This group exists as Starfleet's ultimate intelligence division. These people do the stuff Starfleet doesn't want to officially dirty its hands with. Murders, assassinations, blackmail, whatever it takes to protect the Federation. No matter the cost. Now, the Federation is opposed by two other groups. The two other main groups. The Klingon Empire, which goes through two stages. First stage is sort of, well, Ruskies. There's no better way to explain them. They were a parallel to the Red Scare. They were evil, deceptive bullies, would show up to a planet and try to cow the people into submission to them for what they needed, providing lesser material in recompense, versus the Federation wanting to give people whatever they needed, welcoming them in with open arms, giving them all sorts of stuff. The Klingons at this time viewed plans for what they could give the Empire. Now, later on, the Klingons got redepicted as a group of honorable warriors. A people who everything revolved around combat. Law was a battle, not a argument. Diplomacy was using words as weapons. And oh yeah, pretty much stabbing your competitors in the face in court was a great way to further your house's standing. Because, backstabbing's dishonorable. Poison's dishonorable. A big duel in front of witnesses, that's how you do things. Then you had the Romulan Star Empire. The Romulans were basically a surveillance state. They tried to stay out of galactic affairs generally. They were aggressive and had some of the best combat ships in the galaxy, as next to the Federation's exploration vessels. Yeah. Think about that. Federation's peaceful exploration vessels were on a par with a nation that had some of the best direct combat vessels. Note, the Klingons had solid combat vessels as well, just they weren't quite as good as either the Romulan or the Federation vessels, because they were honorable fighters. The Romulans, though, had one thing that the Federation didn't have. That was cloaking devices. The Romulans were quite willing to use cloaked ships to do espionage, because this is what the Romulans did. The Romulans were a people of spy masters. They ran everything as in a, let's find out what our enemies are doing. Let's plant seeds to make our enemies fight each other, and then we'll profit. Because if our enemies are killing each other, they're not killing us. Or they're not watching us. Of course, the Romulans also had the Tal Shiar, which was their intelligence division, but it was also sort of their secret police. And basically, Romulans would disappear for speaking out against the Romulan government. Or for, just saying things that people in authority didn't like. And Romulans knew, once someone disappeared, you didn't talk about them. You never mentioned them again. And that was pretty much the Romulans. So we've got a group of peaceful explorers with top-of-the-line combat vessels who have a division in them that does a lot of shady stuff to keep them in line. We've got a group of honorable warriors with mostly okay combat ships that just kind of run into problems when they are dealing with Federation because, well, they can't quite stand toe-to-toe with the big, huge ships of the Feddies. And they counter that with tactics. And then we have the sneaky Romulans, who monitor everything, play everyone against each other, and, oh yeah, use stealthy ships that materialize behind you. And that is the main factions of Star Trek. You know what? Next week, I'm going to talk about the mechanics of the Decipher system itself. So until then, I'd like you all to remember to have fun and keep gaming.